Hey everyone, thank you all so much for tuning in. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different as we wait for Insomniac's Spider-Man II. Today we're going to be going back in time, looking at the past 20 years of Spider-Man games. I will be going over each of these games that I have played in that time, giving a brief review of each of them, and then ranking them here in this wonderful tier list I've created. As always, I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well, so please be sure to leave your ranking or your thoughts on these games in the comments below. I'm excited to read through those and see where we disagree, where we agree, and have some civil conversations with you guys. Keyword civil. Let's not get angry over 3D modeled Spider-Man here, okay? So first, let's just familiarize ourselves with this tier list here. So first of all, we have haven't played at the very bottom, very self-explanatory. If I haven't played something, I can't fairly review it. Right above that, we have yikes. This is reserved for only the weakest Spider-Man games, in my opinion, just the ones that really didn't work for me. Back to Formula is for Spider-Man games that had some redeeming qualities, but overall just weren't very good, at least in my opinion. Above that, we have okay. This is for very middle-of-the-road games on this list, games that aren't good but also aren't bad. Above that, we have good, and anything in this tier or above I would consider a fairly solid Spider-Man game. But good is for a game that never really reaches greatness, but also is never really terrible. Brilliant but lazy is really the polar opposite of Back to Formula. It's a Spider-Man game that overall is really, really good, but has a few very irredeemable qualities, or a few really frustrating facets of its gameplay or storytelling. Spectacular is for just an all-around great Spider-Man game, and Pizza Time is reserved for the one or two very lucky winners that are just masterpieces in my mind. So let's start this off by just making the audience really angry. It is to my great shame that Spider-Man and Spider-Man II Enter Electro go into... I'm just kidding. I haven't even played these games. I do want to say I have a great respect and gratitude for these games for paving the way for more modern Spider-Man games. The reason I haven't played them is because they were a little bit before my time. Growing up, I just never had access to these games, and since then there have just been so many newer Spider-Man games to stay caught up on that I just haven't ever really reached far enough back into my backlog to play these two. If this video does get 50 likes or more though before Spider-Man II launches, I will play and review both of these games on my channel. I actually think that would be a lot of fun to go back and see the origins of modern Spider-Man games. Now let's start with some of the games that I have actually played on this list with Spider-Man 2002. I'm going to put this one in the okay column. Spider-Man is a pretty solid brawler from 2002, but it doesn't really feel like a definitive Spider-Man game. Part of that is because this was a stepping stone toward better Spider-Man games. Spider-Man 2002 didn't have an open world, but it played with the idea of an open world. There was one level that was very open. It gave you access to a lot of rooftops in New York City. It played with some swinging physics and mechanics. And one thing that I really appreciated is that even though it was loosely based on the movies, it wasn't afraid of having its own creative decisions. It added villains to this game that weren't in the movies. Kraven is in this game. Vulture's in this game, Shocker and Scorpion are in this game. It was fun to see villains who never appeared in the movie get sort of the Raimi aesthetic and treatment. This game had some fun encounters and some fun levels, but overall it's just a fairly forgettable brawler that happens to feature Spider-Man and is loosely based on a really good movie from 2002. Next up we have Spider-Man II, and this is one that people might think I'm placing too high, but this is going right up to Pizza Time. Let me explain. Spider-Man II was just a groundbreaking game at the time. It pushed the limits of what a Spider-Man game could be, and for a long time I don't feel like there was a Spider-Man game that matched Spider-Man 2 in creating the perfect package. Spider-Man 2 had great traversal, it had an amazing story, it had really fun gameplay and pretty immersive combat. And when a Spider-Man game improved upon the combat, for example, usually its story and traversal weren't quite as good. Spider-Man 2 was just the most well-rounded and well-put-together Spider-Man package for a very long time, at least in my opinion, and it was the first step. It was the first really great template for what Spider-Man games should be moving forward. Next we had Ultimate Spider-Man, and I'm going to put that one just right below Spider-Man 2. Some people would probably swap these, and that's totally fine. I think that tonally it will just come down to personal preference. Ultimate Spider-Man included a playable Venom, it opened up Queens to explore, it included other Marvel characters like the Human Torch and Wolverine. It was really cool that the studio recognized that they'd captured lightning in a bottle with Spider-Man 2 and pushed it forward in an original story that did a lot for the canon of the Ultimate storyline. Even though I liked Spider-Man 2 just slightly more, I think that these are very neck and neck. Ultimate Spider-Man took everything that Spider-Man 2 did well and just tried to add a lot of new things. Now, not all of those new things worked for me great, and I have just enough nitpicks with each of the facets of that game that it doesn't quite reach the heights of Spider-Man 2, but dang, this was just a perfect follow-up. Now we have Spider-Man 3, and we're going to put this in brilliant but lazy, which again, some people might think is too high. I've always felt like Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3 are great siblings. Spider-Man 2 has a great campaign, but a somewhat lackluster open world in terms of side content. Spider-Man 3 lacks a cohesive main story, but has a really fleshed out open world full of side missions. In fact, Spider-Man 3's story is less of a story and more like just a collection of like 42 side missions. If you play Spider-Man 2 and then Spider-Man 3 right after, in many ways they really do feel like pretty much the same experience. Spider-Man 3 almost just feels like a really big DLC for Spider-Man 2. Each of Spider-Man 3's missions has a lot of variety. The mission design is really interesting and takes you to a lot of cool places like the sewers and the subways. Even though Spider-Man 3, like I mentioned, lacks a cohesive story, it allows you as Spider-Man to go up against a lot of interesting villains in their own self-contained side missions. It's sort of a shame that Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3 aren't part of the same game. It would be really cool if the missions of Spider-Man 3 just acted as the open-world side missions for Spider-Man 2's amazing story. Unfortunately, Spider-Man 3 can't go any higher than this because it lacks a good main story, but I also think that it's a game that is very overhated, and many people I think should give it a second chance. I think that people would appreciate this one a lot more if they tried it again. Next up we have Friend or Foe, and this is going back to formula. I love the concept of a multiplayer Spider-Man game where you get to play as the villains. It really has the appeal that a lot of the Lego games had, where you get to play as all of the characters in the game. It also took Spider-Man out of New York and put him in a lot of different places around the world, and that was an interesting change of pace. There wasn't any free roaming, and the execution of the really interesting concept was less than stellar, and I wish it had been given a bigger budget or more time. But I would like to see a better version of this game because I think the idea is really solid. Spider-Man Web of Shadows is going up here right next to Ultimate Spider-Man. This was another game that felt like it took the Spider-Man 2 formula and tried to improve upon it. It did some really interesting things with the black suit. It had a great story with Venom. Just the execution of some things left enough nitpicks for me that I can't put it up into the pizza time category. I really did not love Peter Parker's performance from the voice actor in this game. It felt a little bit too cringy for me. Some of the really great ideas didn't feel like they were executed quite perfectly. The choice system, for example, often felt a little inauthentic to me. Some of the black suit choices just felt very out of character, and there wasn't enough story to really justify why Peter would make decisions that were that dark. But needless to say, fluidly being able to switch between playing as red and blue suited Peter and black suited Peter was a lot of fun. The story was really interesting, and I would have loved to see what they could have accomplished in a sequel to Web of Shadows. Next up, we have Shattered Dimensions. This one I am also putting up in the spectacular category. Shattered Dimensions also tried to reinvent the Spider-Man gameplay formula by making it a more linear game. We'd just gotten a bunch of open world Spider-Man games, so I don't think anyone was too upset when this game didn't have an open world, though I do think in today's day and age, a multiverse Spider-Man game set in an open world that could change its aesthetic based on the universe you were playing in would be really cool. Shattered Dimensions was more linear, but the trade-off was that you got to play as multiple Spider-Men, and each of them had their own aesthetic and gameplay style, which was just such a great idea. The game also has some really compelling boss battles and set pieces, and included those things at a level of detail that just wasn't possible with open world games at the time. So even though it lost something that many feel is critical to having a good Spider-Man game, it really made up for it by making all of the other aspects of the game as good as they could be. Unfortunately, Edge of Time came next, and though many will disagree with me, I am putting it in the yikes column. This was a huge step back. It was a terrible idea to put an entire Spider-Man game inside one building, especially when the story that the game tells has potential, but just isn't that compelling on a moment-to-moment basis. The game lacks villains, it lacks innovation, it feels like a step back from what we just received with Shattered Dimensions. And then we get back into the movie tie-ins. The Amazing Spider-Man games were right at the tail end of when we got movie tie-ins to games, and the first one was good. I don't know that I can really honestly say that the Amazing Spider-Man game did anything better than these previous games, but at least in my opinion, it was a much better game than Edge of Time. It tried to borrow heavily from the Batman Arkham formula, which was working really well for Batman. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, the result is that this game almost feels too much like a Batman game rather than a Spider-Man game. You spend a lot of it in air vents. Tonally, it feels a lot like a Batman Arkham game. In fact, the story doesn't feel entirely original. It feels very similar to Batman Arkham City. And there's just a handful of nitpicks that I have, such as the camera being too close to Spider-Man in the open world. They try to give you an over-the-shoulder look, but it just obstructs a little too much of the view when you're web swinging. There's really nothing wrong with this game. It just never exceeds greatness, in my opinion. It never quite swings for the fences like Shattered Dimensions or Web of Shadows, but it is a pretty solid game that knows the audience that it's playing to and does a good enough job at doing that. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, I'm putting in the okay category. Once again, I think Beanox took a step down after The Amazing Spider-Man. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is almost as good as The Amazing Spider-Man, but in some ways it feels a little bit lower budget. The game does have a handful of interesting boss fights, and it does have some interesting characters that did not show up in the movies. Carnage is in this game, for goodness sake. Kraven is in this game. The web swinging was definitely the best web swinging that we'd experienced since Web of Shadows, but that wasn't really a high bar to clear. Everything from the rushed story, the frustrating open world content, and the very 2007 looking graphics for 2014 just made this a really disappointing package that felt rushed and too low budget. And then there were two. Spider-Man 2018, I am going to put in spectacular. The story of Spider-Man 2018 is great, but I feel like the pacing is a little bit too slow, especially in the first act. Some of the side content, like Tombstone's side mission, really shines, but other things like the surveillance towers and the pigeons and Screwball, they all just felt a little bit lackluster. There was a lot of filler and artificial length to this game, but it definitely was the best Spider-Man game that we'd had in a very long time, and I would actually say that this maybe belongs in a tier between these games and Spider-Man 2. And I do want to emphasize that Spider-Man 2018 is a technically far more impressive game than Spider-Man 2. Again, this was like a very compelling next step for not only superhero games and Spider-Man games, but just open world games in general when it came out. It's very impressive and it's very good. There's just enough in the open world and the pacing of the main story that frustrates me that I can't quite move it up into the Pizza Time tier, even though I would consider it to be a better game than Spider-Man 2. So it's this weird situation where I think I'm ranking Spider-Man 2 above it just a bit because I like the pacing better, and there's nothing in Spider-Man 2 that frustrates me as much as the few things in Spider-Man 2018 that really frustrate me. However, one of the things I really respect about Insomniac is that they do seem to learn from their mistakes. Spider-Man Miles Morales is going in the Pizza Time tier. The gameplay is great. The story is less interesting than the 2018 game, but I like the pacing a lot better. It feels like a perfect size and scope for the density of content that they have in that game. It has by far the most fluid gameplay and the best looking open world. It allowed us to swing around in the snow, which was something that we hadn't done. And after what we've seen from Spider-Man 2 in its gameplay demo, I have no doubt that that is going to be my favorite Spider-Man game of all time. We might have to make an extra tier here, like Pizza Time with extra toppings or something. But that is my ranking. I'm sure that everyone will have a different ranking, but I'm interested to see yours. So again, please be sure to leave those in the comments below so I can check those out. Thank you all so much for watching. It really does mean a lot to me. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and if you are excited for Spider-Man 2, as I will be covering that game leading up to its launch and after its launch. There will be so much to talk about. But again, thank you all so much for watching. We will see you guys in the next one.